接下来有请 West Center 先生为我们深入解读21世纪的神经反馈训练技术，掌声欢迎。
Thank you for your kind welcome. And in the next 20 to 25 minutes, I want to give you a very brief, top-level view of where we think that neurofeedback is going to be headed in the next 25 years. If I get it right, I'll make sure to tell everybody I got it right. And if I got it wrong, I'll ignore it. So one of the things that I think is going to happen is we're going to move from pathology to brain optimization. In other words, instead of treating people in a therapeutic way, we're going to use neurofeedback to optimize the brain for optimal function. So we're going to move from treating diseases or brain conditions with pathology to how do we increase function despite people's pathologies. The other thing that I think is that AI is going to play a role in helping to optimize training. So how are we going to do that? Well, we use databases to compare our individual training to what the database is saying, but we will optimize training based on the individual rather than on normative standards. The other thing is we are going to be able to fuse multiple databases, multiple sources of data. So MRI, fMRI, SPECT, PET, other imaging modalities along with EEG in order to better target our training targets with neurofeedback. We'll also see some closed loop ecosystems, meaning that we will train people to their own databases. And so right now we have databases that are mainly a function of a normative sample. So some of our databases are quite large with thousands of individuals, and others are very small with 700, 800 individuals. I think that one of the ways that brain-based training or database training is going to change is that we are going to be able to do an initial assessment and develop a database based on individual characteristics so that we'll no longer be training to some normative sample, but we'll be training a person to their own brain performance. The other thing is going to become important as we see the gray wave or the gray tsunami coming with the rapidly aging population is a need to do brain longevity training. What I mean is that as health improves and our lifespan increases, our brain span or our brain function is not keeping pace. So we have many people who have decreased brain function even though they're living longer. So we need for the brain span to equal lifespan. We also need to be able to manage artifacts. One of the biggest problems that we have in EEG neuroimaging is it's very subject to muscle movements, blinking, the movement of the cables. And so using AI to predict when an artifact is occurring and to be able to remove that from the record so that we're not training to artifact, but we're training to actual EEG. This is going to be greatly enhanced by AI real-time artifact suppression. And we will be able to adapt our protocols as we are training using AI modeling. We also can predict who's going to respond best to training using these predictive AI models. We know that some people train very rapidly, other people train very slowly. Many times it has to do with a specific brain presentation. For example, children who have maybe multiple diagnoses, ADHD and depression, or ADHD and maybe autism spectrum disorders. They may train at different rates. Well, the AI can help us predict who's going to train at what rate and adjust our training protocols to base on the individual performance. Also, we should be able to use AI to predict who is going to have an abreaction to training. Not everybody responds well. Sometimes people will get nausea or headaches, or they will experience a worsening of symptoms. Using AI, we should be able to predict when that's going to happen before it happens and to adjust the training protocols to minimize the discomfort of the trainee. And then many times I think that it's good to be able to have AI as an assistant. So AI can present to us many different options in training to suggest when it's time for us to change thresholds or when it's time to change our training targets. And so we can use computer-based modeling, large language models, to be able to help us in real time adjust training protocols. The other thing that I think is going to happen in the next 5 to 10 years is a change in the way that we use skin interfaces with our sensors. So dry polymer electrodes that don't require gel, which make it much easier for the people who are training. Right now, we get a lot of complaints about gel or saline in the hair, and it's not convenient for people who need to return to work after their training. Dry polymer electrodes don't leave sticky gel in the hair. And so I think those are going to become more and more common. Right now, we have a problem with dry electrode interfaces in that they produce, they act like a piezo device and can create an artifact, particularly in the lower frequencies. So we need to find some solutions to that particular problem. But I think those are easily solvable if we pay attention to them. EEG mesh fabrics. So we can embed the sensors in a fabric that can be placed over the head, much like a swim cap, so that the sensors make direct contact with the scalp based on the pressure from the cap. And again, we don't require any gel or saline to interface, but we can connect directly to the scalp. Nano sensors at the University of California at San Diego, we're actually seeing some of these nano sensor arrays that are embedded in a material much like an adhesive bandage, and they have nano batteries that power them. And right now we're only able to get the prefrontal cortex with those sensors, but I think with evolving technologies, we should be able to get greater coverage using nanomaterials. And then augmented reality and virtual reality for feedback. We're already seeing virtual reality being used, particularly for people who have specific phobias. And so using VR in an immersive way allows them to confront the environment for which they have a phobic reaction, and then to do real-time EEG measurements of their trauma response, and then having a therapist that's there who can talk them through that. We're seeing that augmented and virtual reality can play an important role, particularly in trauma situations. And then bidirectional EEG and transcranial alternating current stimulation. We're already using those technologies in our clinic to do EEG biofeedback, and whenever the training targets aren't being reached, we stop the EEG biofeedback, we deliver a transcranial alternating current signal to the brain to entrain it, and then we resume with neurofeedback. And so I think that AI is going to help us with that as well, to be able to automate that process so there's not as much human in the loop, so there's not as much of a workload on the clinician, but the computer can help us to monitor those responses in real time. And again, we're seeing that now in experimental capacities. I think it's going to be available to the clinician in the next 5 years or so. We're seeing a rise in immersive neurofeedback. And there's a little bit of a problem with immersive feedback in that when we give too much stimulus to the brain, it doesn't replicate the everyday environment. And so we don't want to provide so much stimulation in the neurofeedback setting that it doesn't allow our trainee to be successful in the boredom of everyday life. I mean, most of us don't live in an immersive virtual reality environment. We live in a world of work where we're interacting with computers or we're interacting with our colleagues. It's not a high stimulus environment. And so the danger of doing virtual reality and other augmented reality types of feedback is we end up rewarding high stimulus environments when most of life is lived in a low stimulus environment. So we do need to be careful with how much reality we inject into the training paradigm. We are seeing holographic dashboards come in, and again, these are experimental and investigational techniques, but I do think that in many instances, it allows us to see the brain in 3 dimensions as the clinician while our trainee is working in neurofeedback, and we're able to track their progress by looking at what's going on in the brain as it's being trained. This enables us to do three-dimensional cortical state visualizations in real time. And so with the advent of SW Loretta, for example, standardized weighted Loretta, we can actually image the brain as the trainee is actively engaged in neurofeedback so that we can see whether or not we're having the desired effect, particularly in the deeper cortical sources and even in some of the subcortical areas. One of the things that has evolved in the last 5 years is the ability to do some cerebellar neurofeedback, which I think is going to be particularly important for movement disorders and for cerebellar depression. We are seeing that one of the things that can be added to neurobiofeedback is bioadaptive environments where we can brighten the room, increase sound, provide a more immersive experience. But again, the danger there is that we provide too much stimulation during the neurofeedback, and we need to balance that. And then multisensory reward systems. With our autistic children, we're finding that audio and visual rewards are not nearly as rewarding to them as tactile rewards. And so we use immersive feedback. So we might use a stuffed animal that has a vibrotactive device inserted in it. The child will clutch that stuffed animal to them, and then when they receive a reward, the animal will vibrate. And so it vibrates to the point that the child experiences it as rewarding, but not so much vibration that it produces artifact. One of the things that we are seeing is the necessity to do neural profiling. What do I mean by that? Well, again, going back to the idea that databases train people to a neurotypical population, sometimes we have people who are peak performers. We don't want to train them to quote unquote normal. As my mother says, normal is just a setting on the clothes dryer. We want to train people to their peak performance capabilities. And so we need to create multidimensional structures and maps of the brain that reflect that optimal performance. We also want to see an integration of QEEG, MRI, fMRI, DTI data. We're actually part of that. Now we use it in forensic settings where we have the ability to collect a lot of data on an individual to help understand their behavior in why people do the things that they do after they've done them. So it's the forensic is always looking back, never looking forward. So we're trying to explain human behavior based on brain-based metrics. SPECT and PET help us to understand metabolic patterns. These are particularly important in neurodevelopmental and neurodegenerative disorders where blood flow is a problem. So, for example, in our Parkinson's and our dementia patients, we're seeing that having SPECT and PET done at the same time we're doing QEEG enables us to better target the brain because the brain needs blood flow in order to learn. And again, we can never forget that neurofeedback is primarily a learning paradigm. The brain is learning how to respond and regulate its own behavior. And so targeted supplements have been extremely helpful, like nitric oxide, for example, to increase cerebral blood flow because neurofeedback places a blood flow demand on the brain. We don't often get MEG because there's too few magnetoencephalographic clinics that we can get it, but when we can, it enables to get presynaptic that MEG gives us, and postsynaptic, which is what EEG gives us, so we have a more complete view of the brain's electrical potentials. And then connectomics, which is how the brain is connected, is becoming increasingly important. We are relying less on spectral power and more on the brain connectome to understand individual brain dynamics. So, how do we move beyond the ICD and the DSM and diagnostics to improve brain health? The 3 pillars of brain health are not neural, electrical, or blood flow. They're diet, sleep, and exercise. Those are the pillars that underlie brain health. And so we need to speak to those issues with our patients, as well as, you know, how do we self-regulate? How do we look at symptoms and train symptoms in isolation from a diagnosis? So, for example, ADHD is not one thing, it's many different things, and many of them have functional deficits. So maybe a deficit in attention, or a deficit in short-term memory sequencing, or a deficit in affect regulation. And so we can't train all of that at once. We can choose to work on individual symptoms, and as we work on the symptoms or functional deficits, I prefer to say, then we can improve a person to the point that they may no longer be diagnosable clinically. So we want to move to the symptom-based self-regulation based on brain performance metrics. Again, we can use neurofeedback to optimize sleep and to de-stress. But those, again, stress and sleep play a role into every mental health diagnosis. Emotional resilience training. Many of my colleagues that are here over the next several days are trauma-informed therapists, and they're going to talk about how emotional resilience can be impacted positively by not only neurofeedback, but by diet, sleep, and exercise interventions. Peak performance is another area where we are seeing a rapid growth in neurofeedback. As a matter of fact, BCIA made a decision 2 years ago to give a separate certification for peak performance. So now a person can be certified as a peak performance trainer. And so many of our athletes, many of our other executives, CEOs, C-suite executives are taking advantage of peak performance training using neurobiofeedback. And then preclinical cognitive decline mitigation. As a senior myself, I'm very interested in how can we mitigate the onset of cognitive decline as we age. And Dr. Daniel Amen, who's a dear friend of mine and is an expert in SPECT, says that the memory loss isn't normal aging. Memory loss is a sign of a problem. And so being able to use EEG to predict when cognitive decline may come several years down the road allows us to intervene sooner. So how do we use EEG to preserve brain longevity? One is to preserve the networks. We know that network function is an early bellwether of cognitive decline. So the salience network, the default mode network, the executive function network, all begin to show deterioration in coherence and lag coherence and especially information flow years before the actual signs that everybody notices as cognitive decline show up. And so we can use network efficiency to determine when we need to do a targeted intervention. And again, the first level of intervention is always going to be on the 3 pillars of health: diet, sleep, and exercise. And then when we can use targeted supplements, we will. When we can do neurofeedback, then we also should do that. White matter guided protocols are mainly based on diffuse and tensor imaging. But one of the latest innovations in EEG is a predicted DTI overlay. So we're able to predict, based on coherence, lag coherence, and information flow, the health of the white matter using EEG. This is something that was a development of Ernesto Palmero Soler, the developer of standardized weighted Loretta. But being able to use EEG to predict white matter tractography has been a game changer because it's much less expensive than diffuse and tensor imaging, and it's something that can be done in a matter of minutes in an EEG clinic rather than having to send them to a MRI imaging clinic. And then many of our aging and resilience strategies, some things that can be done in a group setting, things that can be done in a non-clinical setting, in an educational type of a setting, are things that we can do to increase cognitive reserve and then to prevent entropy, or the gradual winding down in terms of brain performance. So what do we need to see happen in the next several years in terms of sensors? Well, as I spoke to you earlier, we need to have some really high fidelity dry sensors. And this is an area where the technology corridor here in the Asia Pacific Rim has led the way in the development of high fidelity dry sensors that get rid of conductive gel, paste, and saline. And wireless ultralight amplifiers. Some of the new amplifiers that I've seen in development will fit in the palm of your hand very easily and will sample anywhere from 19 to 32 channels, anywhere from 500 samples per second to the one that we use in our clinic that samples at 4,000 samples per second. And so we're having an increased sampling capability, even a much, much, much smaller amplifier. On-scalp photonic sensors that allow us to be able to look at blood flow as well as EEG in real time, so that we can see the demands of the brain as they're occurring, because the brain will water with the blood flow. An area that's going to be demanded, or it is anticipating the demand, and so it provides blood flow prior to the demand so that the brain can then make its performance requirements and utilize not only the blood flow, but the water, the neurotransmitters, and the other things that go along with blood flow. And so using on-scalp photonic sensors, we're able to track that in real time. We can also do neurofeedback and hemoencephalography at the same time. And that's a game changer as well. So we can reward both the blood flow as well as the electrical activity of the brain in real time. Wearable hybrid EEG and FNRS, again, this allows us to do hemodynamic sensing and in a way reward both. Currently, we can reward one or the other, but I think it's not too long from now that we'll be able to reward both of those things. And then to the next generation are these multi-vector neurointerfaces that allow us to record autonomic nervous system activity as well as the central nervous system in real time, so that we can provide a more holistic rewarding system, so that when a person's parasympathetic system can come online to deactivate the autonomic nervous system, we can see a relaxation response, not just physiologically, but also in terms of the EEG. Again, with AI innovation, we'll have real-time instant artifact detection and removal, so we'll declutter the signal. For those of us who watch the raw EEG as we're training, this is incredibly important because it removes sensor noise and it also removes artifact noise, and allows us to do microstate extraction. So whether it's microstate A, B, C, or D, we're able to see in real time how the brain is responding to the neurofeedback, and it allows us also to do measures of entropy. So we can do entropic analyses while we're also doing microstate analyses. And again, we're beginning to move away from spectral power into these more complicated computations of brain performance. Automated classifier selection allows us to use AI and machine learning to be able to test multiple analytical approaches in real time as we're training the patient to find out what's the best way to train this patient, and adaptive learning curves that help us to be able to tailor our reward and our thresholds to the individual. Too many times we use what we would say is a cookie cutter or a one-size-fits-all approach, and this is not necessarily what's appropriate for the individual. And so many times an adaptive learning curve that allows us to use a plyometric training principle. What I mean is that as the brain reaches a training target, it tends to plateau. And so AI can help us to predict when the plateau is about to happen, and then adjust the training target so that the brain doesn't plateau, but that it goes to the next level. That just told me I need to hurry up. Again, home-based neurofeedback protocols, I believe, are going to become more and more common as we enable the clients to be able to put the sensors on and the sensors to be in the right place without our assistance, which is the current challenge to home training. We often have people putting the sensors in the wrong place, and so using a mesh-embedded sensor system where they can't put it in the wrong place, I think is going to enable us to be able to do more and more home training. AI monitoring to help us monitor multiple trainees with one person guiding the training, having pretty accurate, and again, in neurofeedback, we don't have to have the electrode exactly in the right place. It just needs to be close. And so these home-based systems don't need to be as accurate as a research or a clinical system, but having consumer-grade accuracy allows us to do more home training, remote clinician dashboards that allow the clinician to track multiple patients who may be training in a distributed fashion. I think is the way that we're going to make more neurofeedback available to more and more clients, even though there are fewer of us to do the training. I listed, 5 things that are really a current a problem in terms of being able to make neurofeedback available to more folks. The thing that I am currently working on with both BCIA and the International Society for Neuroregulation and Research is a universal competency standard that allows us to have trained individuals at the technician and clinician levels, so that regardless of where you are on the planet, you meet the same training requirements in order to be a neurofeedback trainer. So some of our standards right now are unrealistic. You don't need to do everything that the standards say you need to do to be a neurofeedback technician. So I'm not talking about lowering standards, I'm talking about making standards more realistic for the training environment. And then the clinicians will be held to a higher standard, and they'll be in a position to supervise. But all of these things are things that we need to address in the next 25 years to make neurofeedback more accessible to more people to train. And then how do we have regulation and standardization that allows for a seamless experience of neurofeedback regardless of what country you're in or what language you speak or what culture you found yourself embedded in, and having universal formats of equipment, safety protocols, evidence-based benchmarks, neuroinformatics standards, and global interoperability will allow us to be able to train the maximum number of people because the need is growing. More and more people need access to what we can give them, and we need to adjust so that we can deliver that to the most number of people that we can. Thanks for your attention.
Okay, thank you so much. 我们非常感谢 West Center 先生为我们带来